19. Ascension. When at last he emerged from the vault with Thuncoat and the relieved Tlaloc, apparently unneeded by limping but proud Acoat, in his wake the gathered royals had dropped to their knees before Ichtak VI, Tlatoani of Sholosha'idi. They had bound his wrists and ankles in bracers of gold and jet, and covered his shoulders in a broad cloak woven with ancient proverbs of such intricacy they seemed more texture than text. About his neck they hung amulets of master-crafted obsidian and jade, and around his waist a gold-scaled kilt of fine silks had been fixed. The one thing left was his crest, to be bestowed upon him by Tepeklan's Speaker of the Word, atop Shahwitzul. When he affixed forgiveness to the kilt and made for the main wings of the palace, however, it was not the great interior stairway climbing the center of Shahwitzul for which he headed. His eye was for one thing only in those heady first moments of rule, and no protest from the trailing nobility of Sholosha'idi would stop him. Thuncoat had led the gathered royals to the summit, and Tlaloc had been dispatched with orders for the legionary high command, carrying the royal seal. That left Ichtak alone to wander the palace halls with Kehuili in his arms, all strangely vacant. The world above thrumming with life as it awaited news of the succession, even as the emptied nerve center of Sholosha'idi sat cold and lifeless below. Only as he entered the halls downward into the inquisitorial penance chambers did he encounter other souls in the gloomy passages. First, they were no more than echoed arguments from up the way. Then, figures jostling in a shadowed doorway came into view. 2 men trying to shout their way past several palace ektal and an agitated inquisitor barring their path. They were Tishak and the battered, exhausted Acoat, he saw, the prior supporting the weight of the latter when the argument allowed. Upon his approach, Tishak looked glad, as if reinforcements had arrived. It was only when he saw the veil that he dragged Acoat backwards out of the way, bowing low. "Hail, Tlatoani." The ektal fell to their knees at the words, eyes averted. The inquisitor did the same, touching his snout to the dark stone, muttering a mantra from the Bastion of Will. He had done so in the center of the doorway. Ichtak handed Kehuili to Tishak, who took the honored queently hound with the same care her master had shown her. "Out of my way." Ichtak's hand was on the hilt of forgiveness, but the inquisitor needed no more motivation than his tone to scramble as if stricken. The ektal gracefully backed off in kind, and he strode into the halls of penance, his nose assailed by the scent of spilled blood, and the omnipresent incense haunting the Inquisition's presence. Years had passed since those tumultuous days after Shatal's execution, but the mere existence of this part of the palace never let him forget the sights and sounds of the penance chambers. Ichtak had never felt the caress of their knives or the weight of their irons around his wrists, but the threat had always been there, left roiling over his head like a gathering storm. When Shakoat would visit him in the night, keeping him sleepless and immersed in the mantras of Harakwe, the ancient priest would guide him down these corridors, to hear the screams of the repentant as their flesh was marked with their shame. Ichtak's memory imbued the rooms with those screams even now, when the stifling, blood-damp quiet of the wretched place seemed so oppressive. There were 4 alcoves before him in a semicircle, foreboding pockets of dark stone, fixed with drains, centered with racks which could be laid low like gurneys or swung high, to leave the penitent dangling by raw ankles, their curved walls boasting ornate shelves which proudly displayed the gleaming tools of the Inquisition's craft. All of them were now empty, all save one. Ichtak barely recognized the slight man before him, face down on the slab, his neck craned at an awkward angle, half conscious in a pool of his own blood. The coat stripped from his back left the raw flesh beneath exposed to the dim lantern light, where scars had been opened and reopened, ensuring the pattern would forever be visible once the wounds were allowed to heal. The feline's dazed face, bruised and swollen, was somehow worse. The orbital bone on the left side was broken, and the face and eyelid about it were horribly swollen, the eye itself having disappeared in a mass of blood-matted hair and bruised, bloated flesh. The mouth hung open, many of its sharp teeth broken, a wet sputter of mucus-strained breathing accompanied by a languid stream of blood trickling from raw gums and torn lips. Ichtak turned for the Inquisitor, still prostrate in the hall outside, and dragged him to the slab by his robe. The man fumbled with the binds that kept the prisoner prone, not needing to be ordered. Setiawan coughed, the noise wet and exhausted, and Ichtak brought a hand to the feline's head in a staid attempt to calm him, uncertain whether he knew who had arrived. The wounds on his back came into focus then, rippling in the gloom as Setiawan tried to stir with a body stricken dumb and frail by days of excruciating stillness. They were passages from the Bastion of Will inscribed in mortal flesh, condemnations of lust surrounding a broad, still bleeding Triskelion. A final reminder from his mother, he thought. Dutiful as her actions had been revealed to be, this seemed a low thing. But Ichtak took some small solace in the fact she had not had Setiawan killed. He had a fleeting moment to wonder why she hadn't, why she had left him this reminder of a time before his ascension. But wrath fast washed such wonder away. Ichtak sank into a partial crouch, bringing his nose almost to Setiawan's as the Lautani struggled to move. Setiawan's hand came out to Ichtak's shoulder, shaky and uncertain, and he was helped off the rack onto shaky legs, nearly tumbling to the stone. He had wanted to comfort Seti. He supposed he could now, for none would dare stop him. But the inferno which had been raised in him by the sight of the scars was too great to allow any tenderness, even toward Setiawan. He would wish in later days that the inability to comfort Seti had been due to the veil of office he wore, and the responsibility it conferred. But in that moment, he knew only red rage and ruin. More a ravenous Ida in soul than any icy Sholoshaishan. Take him to the physicians, Ichtak told Tishak. Stay at his side, with Kehwili. Tishak bowed his head and made to follow Ichtak's orders, a Koat limping away behind with his eyes trained on the stone. Ichtak turned for the penance chamber again, his hand going back to the hilt of forgiveness, and approached the Inquisitor. His back was against the wall of Setiawan's bloodied alcove, and the priest lowered his head in deference as Ichtak advanced. Who did this? The Inquisitor finally met his eye, on the verge of stammering. Who performed the penance? Tepeklan's media had been as speculative as the Ektal overseers allowed in discussing the recent events at the border. Naturally, the public had been a great deal more speculative, abuzz with chatter about internal conniving and external espionage. Moths to a flame, a good tale involving the threat of war was a favorite Sholoshaishan pastime, and this had been no exception. With the Tlamakti being issued, their chatter had become a tide, sweeping across the empire. Breath collectively held, Sholoshaidi waited as one to see who was the last standing, and what the cause of the struggle had been. Streets were packed and houses emptied, all eyes in the capital straining upward to the peak of Shahwid-Zul. Since the morning they had murmured and speculated in its shadow. It was not them that Ichtak stormed out of Shahwid-Zul's internal stairway for that afternoon, however, eye glinting above the veil. Much as he was obliged to them, they had to wait. He came for Shikoat. The appearance of their Tlatoani sent the gathered royals, senators, and officers to their knees. Those kings, queens, and priests too aged for the full prostration bowed as deep as they could manage, averting their eyes. The wizened Shikoat had no such issue despite his years, dipping with practiced grace to his knees before the stand which held Ichtak's waiting crest of gold and ebon feathers. and touching his snout to Shahwid-Zul's ancient surface. He never left that pose. Forgiveness had been ready in Ichtak's grip when he crested the winding stair before the eternal flame. Shakoat, if he realized the danger, never had time to do more than gasp before the diamond-edged teeth struck his head from his shoulders. The gathering froze. As the wrathful blindness slowly ebbed from him, Ichtak could feel the confusion playing silently through their ranks, some aghast and some simply shocked. Tlaktal, the brutal king of New Tepeklan, seemed almost impressed. Their faces were of no concern to Ichtak in the moment, though. He had a second to realize that he had just spilled Sholosha'ishan lifeblood for the first time. Never had he killed a man of his own kindred, much less a priest. He had not even considered the fact before striking the blow, and now, with eyes upon him and his fury spent, he could spare no time for reflection or regret. The crowds in Shahwid-Zul's shadow, invisible to him from the center of the temple's peak, could not be kept waiting any longer. Shakoat, speaker of the word, would traditionally have placed the crown upon the risen Tlatoani's head. Ichtak had a moment to consider the propriety of being crowned by no man save Harakwe as he placed the feathered helm upon his own head. But it was a fleeting thought, a rationalization of the reddened rage only now ebbing away from his vision. He could try and convince himself this had been the will of Harakwe when he had done what needed to be done. The priestly attendants of the flame shrank away as he spun, but it was not for them he turned. Ichtak looked to Tlaloc where the officer stood amongst the Ektal's finest. The old officer nodded, telling the Tlatoani that all was prepared. Then Ichtak stepped to the stairs, bloodied forgiveness in his hand, into the eyes of Tepeklan. A microphone, newly adapted for use in ceremonies atop Shahwid-Zul, accentuated the already excellent ancient acoustics, prepared to carry his every syllable to the waiting ears of the nation before him. When the Ida marched south through the Kushkot Range, no soul in Tepeklan spoke for peace. We met blood with blood. We rode north to meet the enemy outside the gates of Kushkotlan, in the footsteps of our forebears. We reminded the children of Kramak what the price of trespass is in Sholosha'idi. The crowd was silent as the grave. There had been no call of the Tlatoani's name, nor any recitations of the deeds of his predecessor. There could be no doubt, however, as to who had emerged the victor. "You have borne the brunt of this punishment," said Ichtak. "The fires that were snuffed out on the heights battling the great enemy were your husbands, your fathers and sons. They demand answers. They demand to know who threw wide their gates for Kramak's hungry sons." Ichtak let the weight of the words sink in, gathering his thoughts, polishing the speech he had prepared on his climb from the Underdeep on the fly. It came easily to him, expanding and flourishing with a life all its own. Later, he would come to believe it had been breathed into him from below, that a greater intelligence had been speaking through him. "You have heard rumors, and they are true. By ship and by infiltrator, chemicals were loosed in the barrow dens of sleeping Ida clans by Lautani hands, driving the beasts south in search of vengeance, where they crashed upon our bulwarks. Knowing this, the agents of Izel II's Industrial Council, seeing promise of profit in war upon the far horizon, kept intelligence about this treachery to themselves. Indeed, they sent operatives north to soften the passes, to ensure the furious Ida would strike true." The crowd roared, Ichtak raising a hand for silence. Tired of the assassin's bullet in the agitator's pulpit, the Duumvirate has slunk down to the lowest of deception. They sick the scaled butchers of the north upon us, secure in their coalition, hiding behind their navy in the Isles. The magnates in our midst believed they might fleece the empire of our wealth at the cost of warrior lifeblood. They believe the toothless children of Harakwe will not bite back. There are those amongst us, the affable and the meek, who would appease them. Said Ichtak, I am here to tell the people of Sholoshaidi's dominion that the meek will be greatly disappointed. The cheering began again. Ichtak let it play out, collecting himself, thinking of Ruhualpa. The blood of a high marshal, of thousands of Sholoshaidi's sons, demands repayment. What is the price of Sholoshaitian blood? The streets thundered in chorus, answering in the old tradition, every mouth baying, Blood! Ichtak nodded. The Empire was being prepared, its Ektal legions on the move, and its legionary armies being massed. Even now, Tlaloc's messages were being relayed to legions on the border, ready to execute plans now decades in the making. Just like Ruhualpa at the first siege of Eztlan, Ichtak could feel the weight of history's eyes upon him. It was surreal, like being carried, his syllables automatic. I am Ichtak the 6th, 114th of the House of Tepekishko, Ichtak pronounced. Let it be known to the sea goddess of the Lautani that I vow before Harakwe never to start an unjust war. Ichtak raised his glinting, crimson-stained makwahwit high, catching the rays of the setting sun. But never will I end a just war save by annihilating our enemies. Even the most stunned of the gathered nobility behind him joined in the raucous cheers, the fire of old Sholoshaidi awakened in them. Ichtak was blind to this, though, his eye fixed not on the golden banners waving above the celebrating throngs beneath him, but upon the southwestern horizon. Beyond the curvature of the globe, thousands of miles distant, brooding Lautan stared back. The Titan stirs, he thought. I hope you're prepared to meet it.